In the midst of all this, it's worth remembering there's actually a U.S. presidential election going on. And what we saw happen last night is Bernie Sanders said that he is withdrawing from the race because he didn't see a path to victory and did not want to be a distraction during COVID and to help Biden's chances defeat Donald Trump.
It does come at a time when a lot of us Americans are looking at their healthcare system wanting greater support. And it's interesting that he does have those more progressive policies and yet hasn't been able to gain the momentum of coronavirus.
Well, that's true, although it's also worth noting every Democratic candidate in the field, including Joe Biden, had more progressive health care packages than any candidates did in 2016. And that's really a credit to what Bernie Sanders and other progressive candidates like Elizabeth Warren did to the field. You know, one thing in the last debate, at one point, Bernie Sanders, when it was just the two of them, isolated, socially distanced in the studio, said what we really need is to have Medicare for all. Biden's response was, Italy has that, Spain has that, and that's not helping us deal with the crisis. They have more progressive calls for what a expanded healthcare program would look like, but it's true, Sanders' message did not seem to catch on after Super Tuesday.
And we saw some pretty extraordinary scenes out of Wisconsin for their Democratic primaries. The fact that people were still going out to the polls really has played quite poorly at a time when we're supposed to be having physical distancing.
Well, it looks like Wisconsin will be the only state to have a primary in April. 15 different states delayed their primaries after the onset of COVID-19. And the Wisconsin legislature and Supreme Court insisted on overruling the governor and forcing the vote to happen in person, which really forced voters, particularly those in large congested urban areas, to choose between their own personal safety and having the ability to vote for candidates of their choice. What's important, though, on the Wisconsin election, and which is why it was so hotly contested, is the Democratic primary was probably only the tertiary issue. The more important issues were what was happening in the Wisconsin Supreme Court, who would be eligible to vote come November, and more importantly, as states really rapidly tried to shift their voting procedures, this was seen as a test case even for November.
Because that is the key here. The discussion has been around whether the election can go ahead in November. From what we've heard, there's no way it can't. But at the same time, it would really impact voter turnout. It's non-compulsory in the US, but if people are being told they can't leave their homes, there's real susceptibility for the system to be manipulated.
Well, Annalisa, I think you're entirely correct to point out that it's not going to shift the date of the election because that's set both by Congress and when the new Congress gets seated, when the new president or the old president is inaugurated, is set in the Constitution. So those things are unlikely to change. What is going to have to change is how the vote is taking place. It's not even clear that it will suppress voter turnout if American states, because it's the American states, not the federal government, that sets the procedures for how votes are taken on a state-by-state basis on that general election in November. If states can rapidly shift to mail-in votes, to extending the deadline or early voting, and you're beginning to see states experiment with that. That last stimulus package of $2 trillion that passed, they already committed $400 million in that to supporting states' efforts to shift how the vote is undertaken. But that's something that states are trying to figure out very rapidly at this point.